Our next episode is called Family. It's episode number 76 of Star Trek The Next Generation, and it originally aired on October 1st, 1990. It was written by Ronald Moore, by a premise by Suzanne Lambdin and Brian Stewart, and was directed by Les Landau. Now, while the Enterprise undergoes repairs in orbit around Earth, this episode really winds around three different plots. First of all, we have Worf's parents visiting him on the Enterprise, and in the beginning their visit embarrasses Worf, but soon he tells them he's happy they came, and they bring up the subject of Worf's discommendation, and assure him that whatever happened to cause it, they love him and are on his side. Secondly, we have Dr. Crusher receiving a package she placed in storage years ago, and among other things it contains a holographic recording her husband made for Wesley just after Wesley was born, and she gives it to Wesley so he can view it on the holodeck. Now finally, we have Captain Picard traveling to his hometown in Le Bar, France for a brief vacation, and while there he stays with his older brother Robert Picard in the family home. Now Robert carried on the family tradition of growing grapes and making wine, and he always envied Picard's success and ability to break their father's rules without any punishment. Now, a few days after arriving, Picard meets with an old schoolmate, and the man is one of the supervisors for the Atlantis Project, which is an effort to raise a portion of the bottom of the Atlantic and create a new subcontinent. Now, he offers Picard a job as director, and disturbingly, Picard finds himself considering it. Now, when Robert hears about the offer, he goads Picard into a fight, and after they tumble in the mud for a while, they both burst into laughter, and Picard comments to Robert that he had it coming. Robert agrees, but tells Picard that he needed it, and Robert observes that Picard has been very hard on himself. Now Picard breaks down and admits his shame over the Borg using him to kill so many in Starfleet, and with his brother's help, Picard realizes that his place is truly on the Enterprise. And that is the end of this episode. Now, really, this is one of the most unique episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation ever, for a lot of different reasons. Now, to start with, this is, up to this point, really, this is the only episode that did not have one scene in it on the bridge. I don't know if you noticed that watching this, but you never see even one scene on the bridge of this episode. And it really doesn't need it. I didn't even pick that up the first time I saw it. But this is really an episode more about character and exploring the families of those characters that we've come to know for the first 4 years here. Now, when this first was approached and talked to with Gene Roddenberry and Rick Berman, they insisted that while they were going to have this Picard story on Earth, that they were also going to have a science fiction story back on the ship to make it a little more sci-fi. And they came up with a couple ideas. One idea was that there was going to be a child stowaway that causes problems, but that didn't really go well with Rick, and they decided to get rid of that. Another idea was that people on the ship were suddenly going to be disappearing for no apparent reason, and ultimately it's because of a wormhole. And while I thought that was a good idea, they didn't feel like it fit very well with the Picard episode. So they decided maybe we'll use that, but for a different episode. So that was taken out. And Ron Moore recalls that ultimately they decided that as long as there was going to be an Earth theme, that they should make the entire show about families and do some other characters on the ship and explore their backgrounds. And I think that's what makes it really interesting here. So let's take a look at each story one by one. First of all, you have the Worf story, where Worf meets his adoptive parents on Earth. Now, they've been referred to in past seasons, but the Rashenkos really stand out really well, I think, in this episode, and they're fun to meet. I think the father is pretty funny, how he has all the specs of the Enterprise at home, and he's eager to tour the ship, and is really excited about that, having served in Starfleet before. And they're a little bit overly excited for Worf, and Worf wants them to be a little more, I guess, dumbed down in how much they express themselves in front of him. So Worf does have a little embarrassment with them on board, and he even admits in one scene that he wasn't sure that he wanted them to come, but he realizes after time that he is glad that they are here. And as I had mentioned before, they do mention his discommendation, and they don't really understand that, but they want to reassure him that they're behind him. And Worf, being the proud warrior that he wants to be, he first feels like he needs to bear his discommendation alone. And as you recall, that discommendation came from sins of the father, and Worf and his family were not even responsible for the shame that was given to their family. It was actually the Duras family that should have been guilty. But Worf decided to accept that to preserve the Klingon Empire, and now we see it referenced again in this episode. So it's nice to see that he does have a loving family, even though that they don't completely understand all of his Klingon rituals. I think it's a nice touch, too, that we see another reference by Guinan, and she follows up on one episode where she asks Worf if he'd like to try a drink, and he calls it a warrior's drink, and it actually turns out to be prune juice. And Guinan asks the Roshenkos, why didn't you ever serve him prune juice? And they admit that, well, all he wanted was things that have to be Klingon. But Worf is realizing the value of the humanity and the human side that he's was adopted into. So you kind of see both Data and Worf have something in common here, being driven by two different worlds, both the human side and what they naturally are. So that's nice to see in this episode. So I think that works very well. Secondly, we have the Beverly Crusher angle, and in that she finds an old recording made by her late husband, Jack Crusher. And apparently the fans in the first couple seasons were writing quite a bit wanting to see her late husband, Jack Crusher, somehow in the episode, because they had really mentioned him from the very beginning, from Encounter at Farpoint. And they wanted to see what this guy was like. And so this is a way to do it, and for a way for Wesley to finally connect with his dad, after having not been with him for so many years. And they have a kind of a touching moment together in the holodeck where he watches as his father talks about his impressions, and this is just after Wesley has been born. And also it's kind of sad too, because Jack Crusher intended to make many more recordings, but unfortunately because of the accident that didn't happen. So that was a great moment as well, and brings a little more life to Wesley's background too, as opposed to him just sitting on the bridge pushing buttons, which is what he had been doing for quite a few episodes after the first couple seasons. Now, the big part of this episode, of course, is the Captain Picard story, and a big feeling that a lot of people had on the show, and Michael Piller felt this way too, was that having been going through assimilation by the Borg and basically being raped of everything he was, having Picard then go back in the next couple episodes to acting like he's totally fine didn't seem to make sense to him, considering they wanted this to be a realistic sci-fi show, something that we can identify with and be able to suspend belief a little bit more on the sci-fi elements. So they wanted to explore that a little more, and there was a thought of doing a third part to the Best of Both Worlds. And in a sense, this kind of is. Now, we don't see any Borg in this episode, but we do see Picard still dealing with the after effects of what happened to him. And we see him going back to his roots to kind of deal with that. He meets his nephew for the first time, and they've kind of got it backwards. His nephew actually calls him nephew, so Picard calls him uncle, and that's kind of a nice moment there. And he meets Robert's wife for the first time. I don't think they had met before this. And then we see kind of the discord between the two brothers here. Robert resenting Picard, really, for being the person who breaks away from tradition and not getting in trouble for it. And Picard feeling like Robert's so opinionated, pompous and arrogant, and not wanting to make any changes and get with the times. So you see that conflict there, and there's some great discussion at the dinner table about their two philosophies about that. So some great moments, I think. And one moment, of course, we don't want to impress on this too much, but Picard and Robert do get into a fight, and Picard hits Robert square in the jaw, and moments later they're laughing. Now, if this were to happen in real life, I don't think they would be laughing after such a thing. But the dramatic value of this is really well played here, I think, because Picard is really fighting with Robert because he's dealing with all the things that have been said and going on in the background about his head. Picard really did, in a sense, he even admits this, that he did kind of come back so Robert could help him. And Picard finally admits that he's not the high and mighty captain all the time, that he is dealing with quite a problem here. And in that way, he bonds with Robert in a way that he probably never did before. And it benefits Robert, too, because after Picard leaves, he's able to allow his son to dream a little bit more, because his son had mentioned that he was considering going into Starfleet. And before, Robert was very opposed to that. But now he's kind of softened on that idea after bonding with his brother. So some great moments here, a lot of great things to talk about. I'd love to hear your opinions and comments about this. It wasn't very highly rated. Not a lot of people watched this episode at the time. But I think this episode really stands out and really fleshes out three of our great characters from this. So a big highlight for me. Comment below, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel so you can make sure that you get all the reviews of Star Trek The Next Generation as I go through them and review them. Thanks, guys, and I'll talk to you later.